Everyone thinks they know the story. They think it begins with a blind date, a prince, a love story wrapped in destiny. But that's not where this really starts. That's just where the public was allowed to start looking. The truth, the real story was already moving long before Harry ever stepped into the frame. And the most chilling part is this. The words didn't come from tabloids, bloggers, or bitter critics. They came from someone who was actually there, watching quietly while everything was being built. Markus Anderson was never loud. He was never flashy. If you saw him, you probably forgot him 5 minutes later. And that was the point. He hovered at the edges of rooms where power didn't scream, it whispered. Where influence didn't demand attention, it simply existed. Markus wasn't background. He was the gate. He decided who belonged, who stayed, and who vanished without a trace. In his world, silence wasn't empty. Silence was currency before palaces, before royal titles. Before headlines learned how to spell her name properly, there was Soho House. To outsiders, it looked harmless. Stylish lights, creative people, expensive cocktails, a place where actors and influencers pretended to be normal humans for a few hours. But inside was a completely different reality. Phones disappeared. Questions were unwelcome. Privacy wasn't a suggestion, it was enforced. Powerful people came there to disappear, trusting that what happened inside would never see daylight. Reputations were quietly managed. Mistakes were quietly erased. And Markus Anderson stood at the center of it all. This is the world Meghan stepped into. And more importantly, the world where she didn't just survive, she thrived. She wasn't wandering around hoping someone would notice her. She wasn't awkwardly trying to fit in. She already belonged. People inside that circle didn't describe her as charming or lucky. They described her as essential. She didn't just attend nights, she shaped them. When the energy dipped, she knew how to lift it. When the night threatened to end too early, she knew exactly who to call. When powerful people needed comfort, privacy, or discretion, she provided it without leaving fingerprints behind. This wasn't about beauty. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about ambition in the way people like to imagine. It was about access. Meghan understood people strategically. She knew who wanted what, who trusted whom, and how to keep everyone comfortable enough to stop asking questions. Laughter was curated. Atmosphere was managed. Nothing was accidental. Behind those velvet doors, she became untouchable not because she demanded power, but because she understood control. She knew when to smile, when to disappear, and when to step back just enough to make someone else feel important. And Markus saw all of it. He watched her build a network strong enough to shield her from consequences. He watched her maintain a perfect divide between public image and private reality without ever letting the two collide. Once that door opened, her life stopped being private. It became a performance. And the performance was flawless. People imagined chaos in places like Soho House, loud parties, reckless behavior, people losing control. But chaos attracts attention, and attention was the one thing this world refused to tolerate. Everything was precise. Indulgence was managed. When people wanted more, they didn't ask out loud, they trusted that someone already understood. Meghan was one of those people. She was the connector, the fixer, the person others turned to when discretion mattered more than excitement. Power, she understood, doesn't come from excess, it comes from control. So by the time Harry entered her life, she wasn't learning how to navigate secrecy, she had mastered it. When Harry arrived in Toronto in 2016, he did it quietly. No photographers. No palace handlers hovering nearby. For once in his life, he wasn't being watched. And that feeling meant everything to him. He didn't want rebellion, he wanted relief. And Meghan knew exactly how to give it to him. She introduced him to a world where phones vanished, names were protected, and silence was understood without explanation. To Harry, it felt like freedom. What he didn't see was how carefully that freedom had been constructed. Markus noticed the shift immediately. Meghan moved from organizer to guide, from connector to protector. Harry wasn't just her partner. He was someone she managed carefully, shielding him from noise while quietly directing the environment around him. From the outside, it looked like romance. Inside, something else was forming. There was one night in Toronto that insiders still talk about carefully, choosing their words like landmines. The plan was simple. A private gathering. Controlled setting. Invisible to the palace and the press. At first, everything followed the familiar pattern. Low music. Trusted people. Drinks flowing quietly. Then something shifted. Inside certain circles, there's a word for it. A run. Not a drive. Not a party hop. Indulgence. Substances, secrets. A moment where the line blurs just enough to become dangerous. According to those inside the room, Meghan wasn't just present. She was making things happen, arranging, connecting, ensuring everyone had what they wanted without drawing attention. And then came the whisper. A royal name floated through the room, not because the person was there, but because someone mentioned she might arrive. A cousin. A royal. The reaction was instant. Panic doesn't scream. It moves fast and quiet, because even a rumor, tying a royal name to a night like that, could explode far beyond one room. Something went wrong. No one has ever fully explained what. A scare, a close call, a near exposure. Some say substances. Others say authorities came close. What matters is what happened next. By morning, everything was gone. No photos, no reports, no whispers outside the inner circle. It was as if the night never existed. That's when Markus Anderson's name started surfacing quietly behind the scenes. The man who knew how to clean a room without leaving a trace. The man who understood exactly what it cost to protect powerful people. From that moment on, nothing was left to chance again. After that night, things began to shrink. Not publicly, quietly. Friends from Meghan's earlier years stopped hearing back. Calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. People who had once been close suddenly found themselves outside, confused, wondering what they had done wrong. She didn't confront her past. She erased it. Old circles dissolved. Familiar faces faded. Even family connections thinned into silence. To outsiders, it looked like growth. Reinvention. Moving on, Markus knew better. This wasn't reinvention. It was precision erasure. And once someone learns how to erase an entire chapter without fingerprints, they don't stop. When she stepped into the royal world, the story was polished and inspiring. A modern woman. A humanitarian. A fresh start. But cracks began to appear. Statements didn't line up. Details shifted. Claims softened. Small contradictions piled up quietly. And behind palace walls, descriptions were adjusted, lines disappeared. Biographies were edited. Not argued, edited. Institutions don't do that unless they're protecting themselves. Markus stayed silent for a long time. Silence was his profession. But silence gets heavy when you've watched someone build, erase, and rebuild themselves over and over. And when he finally spoke, he didn't rage, he didn't accuse, he described the blueprint, calculation, timing, preparation. Doors studied long before they opened. He once said she always knew where the exit was. Before entering a room, she mapped it. Before trusting someone, she measured them. Before stepping into a new world, she planned how to leave it. That's what made her different. Not charm, not beauty, precision. To Harry, she offered freedom. To elites, discretion. To institutions, a version they could accept. And when any version became inconvenient, she didn't defend it. She erased it. Markus didn't destroy a legend. He reminded people of something uncomfortable. Behind every perfect image is a person. Behind every person is a series of choices. Some people fall into power. Others build it quietly, without witnesses. And if this much emerged years later, spoken calmly by the man who watched it all, the real question isn't whether the story is over. The question is how much of it is still being protected, because stories like this don't end. They wait. And that's the part most people still don't understand. Silence didn't mean the story stopped. Silence meant it went underground, because when someone has spent years mastering rooms where nothing leaks, they suddenly forget how to protect themselves just because the stage gets bigger. They adjust. They tighten the circle. They change the locks. After the palace years began, the distance wasn't just social, it was surgical. People who once felt indispensable suddenly realized they were replaceable. Some woke up one day and noticed they were no longer in the narrative at all. No calls, no explanations, just absence. And absence, when it's intentional, is louder than any confrontation. That's how erasure works. You don't fight the past. You outgrow it publicly while quietly deleting it behind closed doors. What unnerved those who had watched closely was how familiar the pattern felt. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't emotional fallout. This was controlled withdrawal. The same technique used years earlier, just scaled up. When pressure builds, you don't react. You reduce variables. You remove people who might talk. You simplify the story until it's safe enough to present. And yet, something shifted when the world got louder. The spotlight that once could be dimmed started burning through layers that had always been protected by darkness. The performance that worked so well in private rooms began to strain under public repetition, because control works best when no one is paying attention. And now everyone was watching. Harry, meanwhile, was changing too. The man who had once felt relief in silence began mistaking isolation for protection. Doors closed tighter. Voices narrowed. Advice filtered. The world shrank until it felt safe. But safety came at a cost. When only one person controls the environment, reality starts bending around them, and bending reality requires constant maintenance. What Markus understood, and what others slowly began to sense, was that this wasn't about love or betrayal or fairy tales gone wrong. It was about structure, about how someone builds a life not around trust, but around contingency plans, always knowing where the exit is, always knowing who needs to be kept close and who needs to disappear. And that's why his words landed the way they did. He wasn't speculating. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't emotional. He was describing mechanics, the quiet machinery behind the image, the preparation that happens long before the public ever sees the result. People wanted him to be bitter, wanted him to sound angry, wanted a dramatic takedown. He didn't give them that, because people who truly understand power don't waste energy tearing it down. They simply explain how it works. And once you see the blueprint, you can't unsee it. That's what made it unsettling. Not scandal, not accusation, recognition. The recognition that every move had been rehearsed somewhere, sometime before it ever appeared spontaneous, that every reinvention wasn't a reaction, but a step already planned. That vulnerability, when displayed, was carefully measured, enough to disarm, never enough to lose control. And maybe that's why the story still feels unfinished, because the habits that built this life don't disappear just because circumstances change. People who survive by precision don't suddenly embrace mess. They refine, they adapt, they wait. So when people ask whether more will come out, whether more voices will speak, whether the silence will finally break, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is how much has already been managed so well that it never will? Because the most powerful stories aren't the ones shouted into the light. They're the ones quietly sealed away, protected by people who know exactly how dangerous the truth can be when it slips through the cracks. And as long as there are rooms where phones disappear, names are protected, and silence still does work, this story isn't over. It's just paused, waiting for the moment when control slips, even just a little.